that overview. I think it was very helpful, Giovanni, to give folks just a sense of the statistics, the hard, cold facts. Often in this conversation of immigration, people are a little light on facts and high on hyperbole. That's something that as policymakers we have to deal with and grapple with every day. A lot of this conversation and this debate around immigration is focused on myths out there about what's actually happening with our system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done over the last almost 8 years in the Obama administration. I know we're going to get in, I'm sure Doris and Todd are going to get into a little bit more about what's next. But I'll just start and talk a little bit. First, I figured I would talk a little bit about the border because that is often the central point of a lot of rhetoric and hyperbole and myth. The border is really quite different than what it was, and some of Giovanni's statistics help give you a sense of that. But I'll just spend a little bit more time talking about it from the policy perspective. So over the last 15 years, in both Democrat and Republican administrations, there have been significant investments in border security. This is something you wouldn't often know, but it is true. So I'll just say a little bit about this. So, in the last 10 years, the number of Border Patrol agents along our border has gone from about 8,600 to close to 20,000. They are using a plethora of resources, technology, infrastructure along the border, and as a result, the number of individuals who are apprehended, which is, for policy experts, a key indicator of the flows of illegal migration, has decreased pretty significantly. So when you look at the number of people that were apprehended last year, it was about 408,000. But when you think about the 80s and 90s, the number of people that were apprehended was regularly about a million. And in 2000 was 1.6 million, so a pretty significant number of individuals were getting apprehended. They weren't always getting removed because enforcement resources were such that there wasn't necessarily the investment on the removal side, although there were removals. And at the same time, over the last 15 years, particularly over the last 5 years, I should say, 5 to 10 years, the demographic trends of people who are actually coming without authorization has changed quite significantly. There are less Mexicans coming. The net migration from Mexico is negative, as Giovanni pointed out. And the populations that are coming now are presenting different challenges for federal policymakers and for folks along the border, Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection. So there are, as of last year, of the 408,000 that came without authorization who were apprehended, about 60,000 of those individuals were children. They were unaccompanied children under the age of 18. Nearly 78,000 were families, so family units, a parent with a child, two parents with a child, et cetera. And the rest, about 270,000, were single adult males, many from Central America. So if you think about that number, about 33% of the folks that were apprehended last year were children and families. That is compared to only 4 years ago, in FY13, about 12% of the population were actually children and families of the folks that were picked up along the U.S.-Mexico border. So very different population. People often talk about folks trying to cross the border and not be discovered so that they can get to the U.S. and make their way on. But actually, as we've seen over the last 3 to 5 years, the population is actually not trying to evade Border Patrol and Customs officials. They're actually presenting themselves to Border Patrol and Customs officials because they're fleeing violence. They're fleeing dangerous situations in the Northern Triangle of Central America. That's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And many of them want to seek asylum in our country or other forms of humanitarian relief. People who are not from contiguous countries, according to our laws, get treated differently they have a different process for removal. For people who are apprehended on the northern and southern border, who are from Canada or Mexico, they can be easily returned, the way our laws and our policies work. For people who are coming from other places, particularly people who claim from all other countries, particularly people who claim fear of return and want to seek asylum, they have access to a humanitarian process where they go before a judge, where they talk to USCIS, the folks that process asylum applications and other humanitarian benefits, so they can present themselves and have access to relief. That not all of them are going to qualify for relief, but that does change how we deal with the situation on the border and how we need to resource things differently and perhaps think through our policies. You know, from our perspective, you know, there are things that we have sought to do. It is difficult because the border dynamic is changing so much. So I talked a little bit about, you know, people who come from non-contiguous countries more generally get to go through the asylum process. Children are also treated somewhat differently because they are children. They shouldn't be in Border Patrol facilities for extended period of times or in ICE facilities. And so those individuals, those young people are transferred, they must be transferred over to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services within a 72-hour period. And then the HHS shelters them and seeks to place them in appropriate settings as children. Oftentimes they're coming to reunite with family members or coming to reunite with friends. They're young girls, they're young men, et cetera. And then they also have access to different types of relief. You know, we have sought to educate people, working with our partners to the south in Mexico and Central America about the dangers of the journey, because the one thing that we have heard quite clear and loudly is that you know, we have, you know, a certain number of people actually make it to our borders, but some don't. And the young people along the way, whether they make it or not, or families, whether they make it or not, are subject to incredible violence and vulnerability along that route. So that is something that we have sought to educate people about the dangers of the journey. We have also sought to create new avenues for people to come to the U.S. in a regularized way, using the laws that we have on the books, and the tools that we have, which are limited. Without changes in the laws. So, you know, we have created a program called the Central American Minors Program, which allows certain family members in the U.S. to petition for their young children to come to the U.S. If they meet the refugee definition, or if they don't, we allow them to come in through a very technical thing called parole, which is something we can do. We can allow someone to come into the country for humanitarian reasons and for other reasons. We've also been working with UNHCR and the State Department and others to actually stand up a real refugee infrastructure and program in Central America, and also help Mexico increase their capacity on these issues, because it is such an important it's such an important issue. As I said, not everyone will qualify as a refugee or an asylee, but we believe and we acknowledge that it is important for us to set up a structure that really hasn't existed in decades in this part of in the Western Hemisphere. So that's something that we think is very important, programs that we have started. But as with every program in the federal government, it takes time for those programs to take hold. We launched the Central American Minors Program in December. We announced it in December of 2014. It's taken some time to get it set up, to put forms out, to get people to actually believe in the process and to apply. And obviously, it's not exactly clear what will happen with that program in the future, and the work that we're doing to increase refugee processing in the region. And in addition to that, we've also sought to actually help get more resources down to Central America so that we can help our Central American partners increase security efforts, but also increase economic opportunity. So we know that Central America is in a different place than what Mexico is now, and they need additional influxes of resources to actually be able to move and provide opportunities and security for their citizens. So that's something that we've also been very focused on. We were able to get last year $750 million down to the region, and we are working this year to get that same amount committed for in this new fiscal year. See where that goes. But that's the border, and that's a little bit about what we've done on the border. I didn't talk too much about the work that we've done on the technology and infrastructure side, but and the fencing side. But there is a lot of resources that have been devoted: cameras, fixed towers, sensors. There is fencing, there is vehicle fencing, there is secondary fencing, there are roads. There are all kinds of things that are happening along the border to actually help fortify it more. And there would have been more resources, even more resources actually devoted to this in the immigration reform bill that we supported and that moved through the Senate in 2013. But our goal really, from our perspective, has been focused on, in terms of the security piece of this, has been focused on technology. And now that we've been grappling with the new trends in the migration process, finding appropriate means to process people, to ensure that they appear before their legal proceedings, and making sure that children are treated appropriately as they go through our process. So that's a little bit about the border. But in the meantime, as Giovanni pointed out, there are some 10, 11 million people who have been in our country for a long time. And most of those people came here for good, to increase opportunity for themselves and their families. Many have been here 15, 20 years. And from when we got to the White House, we really had to start thinking about how we manage this huge infrastructure of interior enforcement resources that the federal government also has. So the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, the agency that's responsible for interior enforcement, is an agency that since DHS's creation has grown rapidly. They manage a number of different things. They have detention facilities that and beds that they're mandated to at least pay for every year, about 35,000 beds a year. They also have folks that are focused on helping to conduct interior enforcement activities within the border, and that includes enforcement and removal, and that also includes investigations of Homeland Security investigations. So, from our perspective, it was important to figure out, if we have all these resources, and we know that there are a certain number of people in our country who, frankly, are not our priorities for removal, are not doing bad things, are not criminals, are not national security threats. What do we do with that situation? So what we chose to do early on is establish clear enforcement priorities. Law enforcement officials will tell you, if you have enforcement priorities, you also have to know what to do when someone isn't your priority. You have to know what the procedure should be if you are in a situation where you want to exercise some kind of discretion, prosecutorial discretion, which is a fundamental law enforcement pillar. So we issued memos on in both those spaces, and ICE those memos began to take hold. Those memos, the first versions of those memos were issued in 2010 and 2011, and it took some time for them to take shape. In the meantime, we saw that there were a number of people who were actually in our court system who had been there for years and were not priorities for removal and didn't actually reflect our enforcement priorities that we had put in place. So we conducted a review of our immigration courts cases and ended up terminating or closing some cases that were not reflective of our priorities. And at the same time, we still heard of problems of people who were clearly not priorities, at least for this administration, that were ending up in the kind of web of enforcement. So, the most prominent example of that population are the dreamers, or the young undocumented youth, young people who came here as children, who were somehow ending up in the enforcement process. As the president likes to say, these are Americans in every way except on paper. Young people who grew up in our country, who grew up pledging allegiance to our flag, in some instances don't even know the language of their home country, and are seeking to actually make a better life for themselves and contribute and be a part of the American dream. So in 2012, we moved forward with a policy called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy. That is commonly called DACA. It is a policy that is really an enforcement tool, a prosecutorial discretion tool. If we know that somebody is not a priority, we do not want to use enforcement resources on them, but particularly the Dreamers, who we knew were so not a priority for removal, and in many ways we hope to actually get them a way to get legal through legislation. We felt very strongly that we wanted to create a process for them that would allow them to come out of the shadows, report themselves, and go through security checks, and then be allowed to get temporary relief from deportation and also access to a work permit. So that is what the DACA program did. And eventually, in 2014, we sought to further refine our enforcement priorities, which we did, and we also sought to expand the DACA program and to create a similar program for parents who were undocumented but had U.S. citizen children or children who had green cards. That was called the DAPA program. The enforcement priorities did make their way through and are very much a part of how ICE does their job now, but unfortunately the DAPA program did get stopped in the courts. We also have sought to build stronger relationships with local law enforcement. To be frank, we stumbled a bit in this space early on, and as we were creating programs that would allow us to interface with local law enforcement databases and to talk to local law enforcement when they came into contact with somebody who might be undocumented. Over the last couple years, that program that was first called Secure Communities has been reshaped and retooled and is now called the PEP program, the Priority Enforcement Priorities program, and that program is very much focused on when we know that we want that our priority is to be people who are convicted criminals. Usually, you're going to find convicted criminals in jails, and so we need to be working with jails and local law enforcement to help identify when those people come to the attention of local law enforcement and determine what we should do with them. And so the PEP program allows us to work with local law enforcement. It is still a program that some communities are not comfortable working, being a part of. And we've respected and recognized that, but we have worked with other communities that felt that if we tailored it a bit more to their perspective and to where they were coming from, they could get on board. And so that program is in place. These efforts on the interior enforcement, I think, have had real results. Of course, I'm a little biased, but they've led to the number of convicted criminals as a percentage of the people who get removed from our country moving from 35% of the removals in 2009 to close to 60%. And I would say the rest, at least now, the rest of that population, the 40% who are not criminals, a very large number of them are actually people who are apprehended on the border. So our focus has really been on people who are recent arrivals, who come without authorization, and also on convicted criminals, and then obviously always focus on national security threats, although there are fewer of those than that we encounter. And then, in terms of the DACA program, that program has, that policy has helped almost close to 750,000 young people. And these young people have actually, from our perspective, made the case for a legalization program in an immigration reform bill. They've proven that if you allow young people and undocumented folks to come out of the shadows, if you give them an orderly process for them to get right with the law, they are going to start contributing, paying taxes, buying homes, driving with licenses, and doing so much to enrich their community when they are allowed to actually fully be a part of it. So from our perspective, that's been an incredibly important effort. In the legal immigration space, we've also done quite a bit to try to streamline the process, to try to streamline it for different groups of people. So high-skilled immigrants, there are a lot of high-skilled immigrants who have been in our country for years on a variety of different visa programs, who are seeking to get green cards, but because of statutory caps in our green card system, have to wait years, if not decades, for those green cards. So we've sought to improve the process to allow them to transfer jobs and maybe take promotions while they're waiting in that limbo. We've sought to allow their spouses in the H-1B context to actually be able to work Many of them come here with spouses who are also very highly educated, but then are unable to actually use that education if they can't get an H-1B. And as some people know in this room probably, there's actually a cap on H-1Bs, so there is a limited number of those available for people. So this is a real situation that happens. And so we've created processes to allow those spouses to work. We've also tried to improve the system for students after they graduate. If we had immigration reform legislation, we would be in a place where we would create some kind of visa or green card for people who graduate to be able to move through the process in a more seamless way. But we don't have immigration reform, and so we have to work with the processes and the programs that we have in place. So we have something called the Optional Practical Training Program, the OPT program. In the last administration, in the Bush administration, they actually expanded that program for people, particularly who graduate with STEM degrees, to stay even longer after they graduated from college. And we have sought to enhance the OPT STEM program and provide additional opportunities, a little bit extra time for people to stay, which would give them more opportunity to find another transitional visa like an H-1B or other visas out there for high-skilled workers. In the entrepreneurship space, we are also working, and we proposed just a few months ago, a process that would allow entrepreneurs to come to our country and actually, what we would do in immigration reform legislation is we would give them something called a startup visa, a green card process, where if they show that they're making a certain amount of money and they're creating a certain number of jobs, that they would actually be able to get a green card. We don't have that right now, and so we've created something called the International Entrepreneur Rule, which will allow us to use the technical term I mentioned earlier, the parole process, to allow those individuals to come here and actually start and grow their businesses in the U.S. So that is something we hope to finish in the final days of our administration. We're working very hard on finishing that regulation because we do think it is important to provide some opportunities for entrepreneurs. And I can talk about this issue forever, so I will stop there. We obviously don't know what's next in this space. There is a lot of good work that we hope will continue, and the new administration is going to have to make decisions based on the cold hard facts. I would hope, of what's really going on in our country with respect to migration flows and along our borders. And we will see where they go. I think it's important and I know that people in this room and people across the country are going to be working to educate the new administration. As someone that really I started in August of 2009 in the White House, so I've lived the entire experience pretty much. I know so much more about the system. And have so much more respect for Doris, who spent so many years laboring to make it better. There's so much you don't know when you're not in the middle of actually, on a day-to-day basis, actually implementing the law. I worked in Congress. I was an advocate outside of government where I was trying to change the law. And I love that experience, but the experience of actually running the system is incredibly exciting. It's been a wonderful opportunity. It is challenging and can be frustrating because there are changes that need to be made that seem so commonsensical, but because they require legislation, they are often hard to actually see themselves out and happen. So we have sought to, as much as we can, work within the existing system to make things better, but frankly, we're operating in the confines of a broken law that needs to be reformed and will hopefully be reformed sometime in the near future. So, thank you.